I'm J Wilkinson. Actually, my name is Joseph C Wilkinson, Jr., but everybody calls me Jay, and I'm a United States Magistrate Judge here in the Eastern District of New Orleans. And I've been a Magistrate Judge since March 1995, so it's going on 12 years now.
Are you born and bred in New Orleans?
I am. I was born in New Orleans. When I was 5, my parents moved us from uptown New Orleans to Terrytown, which was a brand new little lower middle class suburb, probably one of the first suburbs on the West Bank. And I grew up in Terrytown, and except for the time when I went to LSU in Baton Rouge and Tulane for law school, when I lived in Baton Rouge and uptown, I've lived on the West Bank of Jefferson Parish my entire life, and I live in Gretna right now, although we've lived in a couple of different places. I guess my first house that my wife and I bought was in Terrytown.
Tell us a little bit about Terrytown and
Sure.
the West Bank.
Terrytown was a great place to grow up. In the 60s, it was brand new. In 1960 is when we moved there.
What do you mean brand new?
Well, they had just drained the swamp and put up these cookie-cutter little houses. I remember it pretty clearly. There were only 4 styles of house you could choose from. And I was talking about that with my secretary just the other day. But there were 4 styles of house you could choose from. I remember my dad telling me that he didn't want to move across the river. He grew up in the Irish Channel. My mother too. I guess my dad lived in the St. Thomas housing project when he was in high school. And they wanted to live uptown, I guess, like everybody else. And they did live uptown for 5 years. But they couldn't afford to buy a house uptown. So they went across the river to this new subdivision called Terrytown. And I can't remember what my dad paid for his house, but it was something ridiculous. I mean, I've paid 3 times more for the last car I bought than he paid for his house. But anyway, it was brand new in that it was still, it was still surrounded by swamp and woods. We thought we were living out in the country. There was only one way to get in and out. It was great for a little kid. And I had 6 brothers and sisters. And my parents still live in that little house. My dad's completely redone it over the years, but they lived in Terrytown for almost 50 years. And it was a great place to grow up. It was very safe. Everybody had kids. There were so many children in the neighborhood that we used to be able to get up, pick up baseball games with full teams and play in vacant lots just from kids in our neighborhood. My wife also grew up in Terrytown. And I have 6 brothers and sisters, so we all grew up in that little house in Terrytown. My parents are Joe and Ann Wilkinson. My dad grew up on a sugarcane plantation in West Baton Rouge Parish, outside of a town called Plaquemine, which is across the river from Baton Rouge. And the cane plantation was called the Island. And his father was the overseer, I guess, or foreman at the plantation. So he was a country boy, grew up on the plantation, but his dad died when my father was 11. His father's name was George Matthews Wilkinson. So the family had to leave the plantation. They came to New Orleans, and they lived in the St. Thomas housing project. My dad was a great athlete at Redemptorist High School. He went to St. Alphonsus High School in Irish Channel, St. Alphonsus Grammar School, I mean, and then Redemptorist High School, where he was a great athlete. And when I say great, I mean, I've seen the newspaper clippings, and he was all city in both baseball and basketball. And he was the best high school catcher in the city in 1952 and 53. In fact, he had some chances maybe to sign with the minor league team for the Pittsburgh Pirates, but instead he joined the Army. And my mother, I'll tell you more about him in a second, because he's an interesting guy, my dad. Interesting in that he's the real salt of the earth as far as I'm concerned. He's a real hard worker. He's been married to my mother for 52 years. He raised 7 children. All of us are college educated. Most of us have advanced degrees and are professionals.
What did he do for a living?
My dad was a draftsman for oil companies and engineering firms who worked for oil companies in the oil field. And at the end of his career, he was a drafting supervisor, specializing in designing and drawing offshore process systems, which are the pipe systems that are used in offshore drilling rigs to make the oil flow. But my dad, because he had so many children, I think, he worked for a lot of companies. Every time some company looked for people to come work for them and offered a little more money, he would go. So he worked for Amoco and Shell, he worked for Boeing and Michoud, he worked for Burke and Associates, he worked for, at the end he worked for Petromarine Engineering was his last stop, and W.H. Linder and Associates actually was his last stop. But he worked hard, very hard, to put us all through Catholic schools, which, you know, we're all Catholics. And then one thing I remember about just two things I remember about my dad growing up. 3 things. The first is, because he was such a good baseball player, when we were really little, he spent a lot of time playing baseball with us. And when I say with us, I mean not just my brothers and I, but every kid in the neighborhood. Second thing is, I told you about that little house that they bought in Tarrytown. It was little, and it was not big enough for 7 children, 2 adults and a dog. So he spent years rebuilding it, adding on, closing in the carport, adding on rooms, redoing the new house. The house was always under construction. It was under construction till the day I left when I was 18 to go to LSU in Baton Rouge. And he didn't finish it till I was married. Third thing I remember about my dad, who's still, you know, I'm talking about him like he's in the past, he's still around and kicking, is how hard he worked. I mean, he really worked hard. He almost always had 2 jobs. So that we had a little den in the house, and he always had a drafting table set up in the den. And he was always working late at night to make extra money for the family. So that's my dad. My mom is a 2nd-generation Sicilian. Her grandparents, you know, they came from Sicily in the 20s. Actually, my grandmother, and their names were Natale Giunta and Antonia Di Giovanni Giunta. My grandmother was actually born in Texas, but as soon as she was born, the Di Giovannis went back to Sicily, and they came back. So anyway, my mother is the daughter of Sicilian immigrants. They came to New Orleans, so my mother grew up in New Orleans. And my grandmother and grandfather on my mother's side, they operated a little bar and restaurant. Restaurant's a strong word to use in connection with what they operated, but they did serve food, so I guess it was also a restaurant. On Chapatula Street, down in, I guess, what we would now call the, I don't know what we would call it now, I guess we would call it the Lower Garden District, but they never would have called it that back then. And it was a working class bar and restaurant right across the street from what was called at that time Service Foundry, which was a fabrication shop for Avondale shipyards. And I've got pictures of it with my mother as an infant sitting on the bar But, you know, they would serve red beans and rice and meatballs and spaghetti to the workers across the street from the yard. And beer was readily available and other things. And so my mother went to St. Teresa School and then on to Redemptorist High School, where both my mother and father attended Redemptorist High School in the Irish Channel, which is where they met. The Irish Channel then was a lower to lower middle class working neighborhood. It's where people who worked for a living lived. There were a lot of people, a lot of children, very blue collar, very working class. It was a lot of fun too, because I can remember as a kid going down there when my father's mother lived in the project. We would go down and visit her every Sunday. I guess not surprisingly for New Orleans people, my wife, her family also grew up in the Irish Channel. And so after we were married, she still had some relatives living in the Irish Channel, and we would go down and visit them and spend Mardi Gras in the Irish Channel.
Is it a white neighborhood?
It was then. It was a mixed neighborhood then. But I would say back then, when in the 60s, when I was a kid, and into the 70s, it was a mixed neighborhood racially, not economically. It was lower to lower middle class.
And St. Thomas. Tell us about St. Thomas.
St. Thomas in the I don't know when it opened exactly, but I know my dad was living in there when he was in high school, so that would have been the early 50s. And my grandmother lived there when I was a kid and into the 60s. At that time was a brand new public housing project. Cookie cutter, brick buildings. As a kid in the 60s, it was just a blast to go in there. It was so much fun. They had courtyards and, you know, porches and balconies, things that we didn't have in Tarrytown. And we would run around and play baseball, and it was great fun. Now later in the 70s, I was a newspaper reporter for a short time in the 70s, and it became sort of a slum. Very poor, a lot of crime. I remember this because I was a police reporter for a year, and I used to have to go down there to cover police matters. And it became kind of dangerous. My mother was the daughter of Sicilian immigrants. They did not stress the education of young women. My mother was the salutatorian of her high school class, extremely intelligent. She married a year after high school and started having babies. She has 7 children. She's a great mother. But even as a kid, I could sense that she was a little frustrated. So the minute I started high school, which was the same minute that my youngest brother went to 1st grade, she went back to school. And she went to, it was then called the Charity Hospital School of Nursing, and it became later the Delgado School of Nursing. And she became a registered nurse while I was in high school. When I graduated from high school, she was graduating from nursing school. And she became a registered nurse, and then she worked for years at the Tulane Medical School and Hospital. She became a nurse practitioner, and before she retired, she was a oncology, hematology specialist. If my mother had been a girl, if my mother had been my daughter, she'd be a doctor. She's that intelligent and that hardworking, and it's just a matter of timing. She was born too early, I guess, and maybe although they were wonderful people, maybe to the wrong parents, because I know My grandfather was a real Sicilian peasant. I can remember him very well. And it never would have occurred to him that a girl should be sent to college. Well, I frequently describe myself as a typical West Bank Yat. You know, I was born in New Orleans. I grew up on the West Bank. I've lived on the West Bank with my wife, who's also grew up on the West Bank, for most of my adult life. That's where we've reared our children. Two of my girls now live on the West Bank, though they're not girls anymore. They're women. When I think of my community, I think of the West Bank of Jefferson Parish. Not just Jefferson Parish, because the West Bank isn't limited to Jefferson Parish.
How'd you do in high school?
You know, I was the valedictorian of my grammar school class, and I was the salutatorian of my high school class. I went to Christ the King School in Tarrytown, and I went to Archbishop Shaw High School in Marrero. I was a national merit finalist, and I did very well in school. Then from there, I went to Louisiana State University for my undergraduate education. I was a journalism major. I graduated summa cum laude. I was fourth in a class of 1,000. When I left there, I worked as a newspaper reporter at the Times-Picayune here in New Orleans for 2 years. I started there when I was a senior at LSU, working full-time in the summer. And, I would drive home from Baton Rouge and work there Friday night, Saturday and Sunday, and drive back to Baton Rouge. When I graduated, I went to work at the Times-Picayune as a general assignment reporter. So I worked there. I graduated in December 1976 from LSU. And I was already working at the Times-Picayune, so I stayed there and worked there. Did you like it? I loved it. The only day I didn't like working at the Times-Picayune was payday. The pay was terrible, but the job was fantastic. I loved every minute of it. I had a lot of fun at the Times-Picayune. I think I had a natural talent for newspaper writing. And I say that because I did really well at LSU in journalism, and I don't think in retrospect that I actually studied that hard. So I must have had some natural ability. But I really liked working at the Times-Picayune.
When did you decide to become part of the law?
Let's see, in my junior and senior year at LSU, because the journalism program was pretty broad and you had a lot of options in which you could study, I took some undergraduate law classes. Media law, they had a political science class called Civil Liberties, another one called Constitutional Law, and I liked it. I liked the way that I liked the subject matter. That classes were taught on a casebook basis, which is how they teach it in law school as well. And I really liked the subject matter. To be honest, which I guess I should be, I was concerned, although I loved being a newspaper reporter, I was concerned about the money aspects because I knew I wanted to have a family. My wife and I had been dating since we were seniors in high school. I knew who I was going to marry, even if she didn't know. I knew I wanted to have children, though perhaps not 7. And I'd seen how my dad had struggled to raise us, and I didn't want to have that. So I thought that she could make more money as a lawyer, that in some respects the job functions were similar. I'm oversimplifying, I know, but to be a newspaper reporter, you got to gather a lot of information and then you got to spit it out in a understandable written form. And lawyering's a lot like that too. So I guess it's one of the things I like about LSU, and it's one of the reasons I thought I had such a terrific experience at LSU, was that although I went there fixated on being a journalist, and that's what I majored in, that's what I graduated in, I was exposed to this other area, which I'd never been exposed to before. We didn't have any lawyers in my family. I didn't even know any lawyers. First time I ever went to a courthouse was as a newspaper reporter for the Times-Picayune. The first time I'd ever seen any lawyers, as far as I can remember. So in my last semester at LSU, I decided to take the LSAT. I did very well on it. And so I went to law school starting in September of 1977. Now, I went to Tulane. Now, I got married 1 week before I started law school. And I liked being a newspaper reporter so much that I did not quit my job at the Times-Picayune. Because I guess mentally, psychologically, I was not sold on the fact that I actually would be a lawyer. I was sold on the fact that if I got a law school education, it couldn't hurt me. And even if I decided to remain a journalist, it might even help me. But I stayed at the Times-Picayune my first year of law school because I was not decided on what the final outcome of my career would be. So in my first year at Tulane Law School, I worked at night at the Times-Picayune on Friday nights and Saturday nights, and Sunday during the day. And on Friday and Saturday nights, I was what's called the late man. So I worked at 5, went to work at 5 p.m. and I worked till 1 o'clock in the morning. And between 11 and 1 o'clock in the morning, I was the only person on the city desk at the Times-Picayune because I was the late man. And my job was very simple between 11 o'clock and 1 o'clock. And that was if some disaster occurred, or at that time, if Francisco Franco, dictator of Spain, died, because I don't know if you remember this, but Franco was in the process of dying for about 5 years. If something dramatic happened, I was to write a 2-paragraph story about it and slip it onto the front page in the bottom right-hand corner. And nothing like that ever happened during the year I was late man, but that was my job from 11 to 1 in the morning. And then on Sundays I was the police reporter, which meant basically you went to the police station and monitored police calls. So anyway.
What was law school like?
I hated law school. I'll be honest with you. I hated every minute of it. The educational approach was that the law professors took, and it wasn't unusual to Tulane. This was the way they taught law and continue to teach it in law schools. It was alien to me. I had just been married. I was working at night. My wife was working to support us. You know, it was difficult, and I'm sure that had something to do with it. But I hated law school. Might as well admit it.
Okay, how did they teach?
The Socratic method,
yeah.
Which is a method that is short on the provision of information and long on the asking of questions. So classes tended to, at least in the first year, which I hated the most. I got used to it after the first year, but the classes tended to be a series of, well, you prepared for them by reading massive amounts of material, most of which were court decisions. And then you went to class and the professors asked you questions.
Such as?
Whatever questions they wanted to ask that had to do with the case.
Give me an example if you can.
Penoyer versus Neff, first class you read in civil procedure, is a Supreme Court case that today has absolutely no applicability to anything that it touched upon back then, although some will argue that point with you. I think it has no applicability. And since I teach civil procedure now, I tell the students this. They still teach it. It's still the first class you read. And it's written in this archaic procedural fashion that really has no application to anything we do today. And it was impossible for somebody with no legal background to speak of, to understand. We spent days on Penoyer versus Neff in Civil Procedure 1, with the professor simply starting by asking questions. All right, you know, what are the facts of the case? And what did Pennoyer do? And what did Neff do? And who was Neff? And who was that? Who was this? And why was this? And why was that? And the students wound up speaking more than the professor, which was ridiculous as far as I was concerned. Now, I know why they do it now, but at the time I didn't know why they were doing it. Ridiculous? Why? Because the students don't know anything about the subject matter. And what they say, to me at the time, carried no weight. I wanted somebody to teach me the law. And what they did in law school at that time was they were teaching you how to think. And they tell you that going in, that that's the way it's going to be. But it's a real adjustment. It's a real adjustment for a 21-year-old like I was. And so I didn't like it, and I didn't take well to it. And I worked really hard. I was newly married. I had a job at night, had this tremendous load. I would go to class where I was spending what at the time to me was a fortune. And I was not getting what I thought I was paying for. Although in retrospect, it turns out I probably did get what I was paying for. I'll tell you how it went. The first year was murder. When I took my last exam in May of 1978, at the end of my first year, I came home, I told my wife, that's it, I'm quitting law school. I'm going to go tell the editor at the Times-Picayune that I'm back full-time. He had already told me I could come back whenever I wanted. And I said to her in May 1978, forget law school. I can't stand it another minute. My wife, who's a very level-headed woman, said, well, you know, and this is basically what she always says when I say something like that. Don't make any rash decisions, you know. Calm down. Give it some thought. You don't have to quit today or tell the Times-Picayune today that you're going to come back and work full-time. It's only May. You don't have to go back to law school till August. Give it some time. I said, all right. Good advice, Sue. My wife's name is Sue. Then I got my grades, and I had made the law review. I was in the top 10% of my class. I couldn't believe it. So I said to myself and to Sue, I guess I'm not as bad as this as I thought I was. Or maybe I did learn something. So after further discussion with my wife, and then, you know, I got invited to be on the law review. I had to let them know if I was going to accept. And so we had a big discussion, my wife and I, like we always have when we have a big decision to make. And instead of going to law school and telling them I was quitting to be a newspaper reporter, I went to the city editor and said I'm quitting so I can concentrate on being a lawyer. And that was it. I quit my job at the Times-Picayune. I started my second year in law school. I got a part-time job because I needed the money. I couldn't not work. Got a part-time job as the night desk reference librarian at the Louisiana Supreme Court Library. And my second and third year of law school were much more enjoyable. They backed off a little bit on the Socratic method. I understood better what they were trying to do. And I'm not going to say I enjoyed the second and third years of law school, but at least I didn't hate its guts.
And so you graduated?
Yes, I did. 1980, May 1980 from Tulane Law School.
And what happened then?
Let's see, I had been a law clerk at a law firm in the summer between my second and third year in law school. And then when I was a senior, and having had that experience, I had no idea, and having no lawyers who were friends or relatives of mine, I had no idea what I wanted to do when I graduated. So I decided I would try to clerk for a judge, which at that time was exclusively a temporary appointment, 1 year, 2 years at tops. And so when I was a senior in law school at Tulane, I had the good fortune of being in the federal civil procedure class taught by Judge Sear of this court. And I was just one of his students. And so when I applied for clerkships I applied for clerkships in this court where we sit now, and at the Louisiana Supreme Court, and nowhere else. And I interviewed, I guess it was the fall of 1979. I had one interview with Judge Sear. I had other interviews lined up, but he was the first one to interview me. And from the first interview, he made it pretty clear that although he wasn't making me a job offer, he was very interested in me. So he had me back 3 or 4 times. And he finally had me back to interview with him, and he made me bring my wife. And when he made me bring my wife, I knew he was going to offer me a job. So I brought my wife. He interviewed us both. It was really, my wife still talks about it. It was so stressful. He was quite an interesting fellow too, I have to tell you. Anyway, that's what happened. I interviewed, I knew I wanted to work in a court. In law school, I had started to think that, you know, judging rather than advocacy was what I was more interested in doing anyway. So he offered me a job, and I accepted a 2-year clerkship with Judge Sear in this court. So.
Can you summarize that job?
The clerking job? Sure. Best job I ever had. Better than the one I've got now, except on payday. Best job I ever had. At that I clerked for Judge Sear from 1980 to 1982, and you know, I don't want to brag too much, but he had very high standards for his clerkship appointments. So I had been on the law review at Tulane. I graduated in the top 10% of my class, and the co-clerks I worked with also had those kinds of credentials, except one of them was from Harvard, one of them was from Notre Dame, and they were not from New Orleans. So the 2 clerks that I principally worked with during those 2 years were high quality and good people, and they remain my good friends today, even though one lives in Atlanta, one lives in San Francisco. Judge Sear's office was a tight-knit group. We worked so hard, I couldn't even believe it. I thought, till I met Judge Sear, that my dad was the hardest working man in America. Well, Dad, with all due respect, Judge Sear outworked you. I never saw a person work so hard. Because he worked so hard, we didn't feel like we could work any less. People don't believe me when I say this, but when I started clerking for him, the Monday after I finished the bar exam, sometime in July of 1980, I did not get a day off, not a full day off, including Christmas, till Labor Day of 1981, when he finally said to me, and by this time I had a baby, okay, why don't you take a day off? So I took Labor Day 1981 off. And my wife and I have pictures of it in our album, because we went to the zoo with our little girl. And I mean, we worked so hard that it's just hard to describe. Why did we work so hard? A couple of reasons. First, at that time, this court had a caseload that was much higher than it is today, much higher, and fewer judges. Second, in addition to the much higher caseload that this court had at that time, this court was also responsible for the liquidation of the docket in the District of the Canal Zone in Panama. In 1978, I think it was, or 79, the United States and Panama entered into a treaty which provided that over time the zone, which was an American territory at the time, would be turned over to the Panamanians, including operation of the canal. Well, there was a U.S. District Court in the Canal Zone. At the time the treaty was passed, or shortly thereafter, the judge who had been the district judge in the Canal Zone retired. Rather than appoint a new judge, when part of the treaty was that that court needed to be phased out by March 1st, 1982, the statute provided that the liquidation of the court would become the responsibility of the Fifth Circuit. Well, at first, various judges would rotate down to the Canal Zone to try cases and liquidate the docket. Judge Sear was one of those. Well, he loved it so much. He loved going down to the canal zone so much that eventually he just took over the whole thing. So by the time I was his law clerk, he had 1,000 cases from the canal zone, which he was bound by statute, by treaty, to have finished by March 30th, 1982, and I was his law clerk. So we probably had, I don't know, 800 civil cases in this district, maybe 1,000, I don't remember exactly, which is 4 times what the judges have now. 3 times, something like that. Plus 1,000 cases from the canal zone, plus the criminal docket. So we had a lot of work to do.
What does a clerk do?
A law clerk to a district judge basically provides him with legal advice in the form usually of what's called a bench memo. And what Judge Sear had his clerks do was everything that came in, everything, any sort of motion, whether it was uncontested or contested and set for hearing. The first thing that happened was the motion, briefs, and everything, before he even looked at it, would go to the law clerk. And it was the law clerk's responsibility to read it all, to check the citations that the lawyers had made in the briefs, to do independent research on top of whatever was provided in the briefs, and to provide the judge with a written, with a memo that outlined the facts, outlined the arguments, made an independent assessment of the applicable law, and then made a recommendation on how he should rule. And we would attach our bench memo to the briefs, and we would stack them up on his desk, and he would take the whole pile home with him on the weekends or at night, or to Panama if he was going to Panama. And in a day or two, they would come back to us with all sorts of notes and questions and highlights and asterisks. And in other words, he would read the bench memo and the briefs, and he would, based on that, he would decide the issue. If there was a trial without a jury, the law clerk sat in with the judge and took notes and observed. He used you as a sounding board. If it was a jury trial, the law clerk would prepare a draft of the jury instructions for him to provide to the jury. But the best thing about it was that he used you as a sounding board. And once he, once you earned his trust, which usually didn't take very long, as long as you worked hard and you you did what you were supposed to do.
And took no days off.
Took no days off except Labor Day, 1981, a day that I'll never forget. It was a great day.
Let me ask you a question. From there to the magistrate's position, that was, what, 8 or 9 years?
It was 12 years.
12 years. So, briefly, what did you do in the intervening years after the clerkship?
Well, when my clerkship was up in September 1982, I went to work for a law firm here in New Orleans, Lemley and Kelleher. And at the time, it was one of the biggest firms in New Orleans, 100 lawyers or so. And I worked in the business litigation section there. And I worked there for about 11 years. I became a partner at that law firm. And that's where I spent most of my professional life when I wasn't here. I worked briefly at another law firm during that 11 years. I left Lemley and Kelleher, went to another law firm, J.L.B. Sullivan, Carroll, and the Board, where I worked for 9 months, and then they basically brought me back to Lemley and Kelleher. Perhaps they missed me, I don't know. But they brought me back, and that's where I spent most of my...
And how did this opportunity for the magistrate position arise?
Well, the good thing about the position of United States Magistrate Judge is it's an open application process. I knew from when I was working for Judge Sear that I didn't really want to be a practicing lawyer. I wanted to be a judge, but you can't be a judge when you're 26. You need the experience of practicing law. And so, having decided when I was 26 that I wanted to be a judge, and knowing myself well enough to know I would never stand for public election in the state system, appointed office in the federal system was my option. That's where I had grown up anyway, in the law, and that's where I was more comfortable anyway. So you can't apply to be a magistrate judge until you have a minimum of 5 years experience,
Practice.
which, well, your clerkship counted for some part of that. I think it counted for 1 year. I don't really remember. So the first time there was an opening advertised for a magistrate judge position and I was eligible, I applied. That was 1987, and it was in the Middle District of Louisiana in Baton Rouge. I then proceeded to, and I didn't get that appointment. I was too young. I wouldn't have appointed me either. But from that point on, I applied for 3 other. Every time there was another opening in Louisiana, I applied for it and was selected on the 4th application in 1994 and 5. So it's an open application process. If there's a vacancy, you read about it in the newspaper or in the bar journal. There's a form you fill out. Everybody fills out the same form. Magistrate judges are appointed by the judges of the court they serve. It's not a presidential appointment. It's an Article 1 of the Constitution position. So you go through this application process. The judges of the court are required to appoint a merit selection panel. It consists of at least 2 non-lawyers and then a sufficient number of lawyers who are supposed to represent a cross-section of the bar. And it's been my experience that they always do. That panel's charged with reviewing the applications and through whatever process they choose to employ to narrow the number of applicants down to 5. And then they submit the 5 names to the district judges of the court that the magistrate judge is going to serve. And then the district judges have the option either of appointing one of those 5 or of rejecting the recommendation as a whole, sending it back to the merit selection panel and telling them to give us another 5. So I went through that process 4 times before I was successful in being appointed. And I found it, at least in each of the times that I went through it, to be very non-political in the Louisiana sense. In other words, I think that the selection process, of course it's easy for me to say this because I was appointed, so naturally I would feel like I was appointed on merit. But I found it to be a very good process. Now, it didn't hurt that by the time I was appointed, Judge Sear was the chief judge of the court. And I had clerked for him as a clerk for 2 years. We remained friendly after I left his clerkship, and we became very close. And when I was appointed, I was not practicing law anymore, because when Judge Sear became chief judge, he created the position of administrative assistant to the chief judge. It was at the same time that there was an act of Congress called the Civil Justice Reform Act, which encouraged courts to hire a lawyer called the Civil Justice Reform Act attorney. I had been appointed as a lawyer to serve on the Civil Justice Reform Act advisory group as the reporter, which meant that I wrote the report of the group. In that capacity, I had appeared before all of the judges of the court to present the group's recommendations to all of the judges. Judge Sear needed an administrative assistant and CJR attorney in 1994, January 94, so he hired me. I worked in the court for a year when the opening occurred, which I should mention occurred because Magistrate Judge Michelle Petard Wynn died in a tragic accident where she was killed by a drunk driver. And I should mention her because she's still badly missed around here. But when that happened, I was working in the court. All the judges knew me. I feel like I had the right credentials anyway. But when I applied that year, I had the advantage of being actually known firsthand by all of the judges not just those I had appeared before as a lawyer.
So what do you do?
Well, magistrate judges, their functions are set by statute. We don't have all of the power and authority of district judges. So we tend to concentrate on that which the statute permits us to do, which is everything that's prior to disposition of the case. That means mostly case management type conferences, discovery, motions and disputes, pleading, motions and disputes, and settlement conferences, everything that occurs pre-trial. Same is true in the criminal side. Everything that occurs pre-trial. Although we have a full-time criminal duty magistrate judge here in the district, Lewis Moore Jr. I do criminal duty probably 3 times a year here, and I've also had an opportunity to do it on the Texas-Mexico border a couple of times. So magistrate judges, for the most part, handle the non-dispositive preliminary matters that arise and actually take up a lot of time in all cases, civil and criminal. In addition, I've been here almost 12 years. I've had the good fortune of having about 350 or 400 civil cases in which all of the parties have consented to proceed before me. There's a provision in the magistrate statute that permits the magistrate judge to exercise all of the powers of a district judge, including deciding cases and presiding over trials, where all parties consent in writing. So I've had about 350 or 400 of those kinds of cases that I've handled, and it's enabled me to conduct about 60 trials, about half of them jury trials, which I really enjoy doing. But for the most part, what magistrate judges do are the preliminary, non-dispositive matters. Unless all parties have consented, then we do everything.
Can you think of a couple of cases that are really stand out as interesting, anecdotal?
Yeah, the ones that stand out to me, the one that's standing out mostly is one I've got now. That's always the case with me. Hurricane Katrina struck New Orleans about 9 months ago, 10 months ago. And as a result of the hurricane, 80% of the city, all of St. Bernard Parish and parts of Jefferson Parish, all in this district, flooded. So we've had about 30 or so putative class actions based on the flooding that occurred, filed in this court. The chief judge and some of our judges, when the cases were filed, they had to recuse themselves because their houses had flooded. When a couple of these recusals occurred as an organizational thing, the chief judge and some of the other judges, who she calls the executive committee, they met and said, you know, we really, have to organize this. So they took the Hurricane Katrina cases, which there have been a lot of them filed around here, and they organized them by category. And the flood class actions make up one category. Well, the court tried to assign those grouped cases to judges who, at least preliminarily, thought they wouldn't have to recuse themselves. So I'm assigned, Judge Duval has the levee flood wall cases, and I'm assigned to them with him. I'm working with him on those cases. There's about 28 of them, I think, last count. I'm also assigned to another group of 4 flood cases, but they're all focused on an allegation that a barge broke through one of the flood walls at the Industrial Canal and caused that flooding in the lower Ninth Ward in St. Bernard Parish. Judge Berrigan has those cases, and I'm assigned to those as well. And this has only been going on that I've been assigned to those. I wasn't originally assigned to those cases. but I was assigned to them, I guess, in March of this year. So that's 4 months ago, I guess. The two other things that to me are most interesting, I guess they're they're not really things I've handled as a magistrate judge here. They are things I did as a law clerk for Judge Sear, and my assignment temporarily to work as a magistrate judge on the Texas-Mexico border. When I clerked for Judge Sear, he had two things going on that were just very interesting to me. One was he presided over a criminal case called Bry Lab, in which the government had instituted an undercover operation, basically, that wound up with the indictment of 5 defendants, one of whom was the reputed mafia boss of New Orleans, Carlos Marcello, the second of whom was the chief administrative officer and top assistant to then Governor Edwin Edwards. His name was Charles Romer, who was the father of a person who later became governor. And it was a corruption case, basically, a bribery case, basically, although it was dressed up as a RICO case. The indictment came down a week before I started working for Judge Sear as his clerk, and went to trial for 4 months in the middle of my clerkship, and by the time all the post-trial motions were over, my clerkship was over too. So I spent almost the whole 2 years working on that. And it was just very interesting because of the characters involved, the nature of the charges. It was, it was a big-time government corruption case. And the outcome was that 3 of the 5 defendants were acquitted, found not guilty. But 2 were convicted. One was Carlos Marcello and one was Charles Romer Sr. So a big part of that trial were surreptitiously recorded conversations, and there were tons and tons of them. And a lot of the pretrial motions and trial motions required that we, Judge Sear and I, listen to these conversations. And it just took hours and hours, and we would sit here all night listening to these conversations of Carlos Marcello talking to various public officials. And I don't know, I just found it I was 25 at the time, so maybe that had something to do with it, but I just found it a very interesting insight into the way that some business people and some government officials conducted themselves at that time. It was an excellently tried case, too. The lawyers just did a fantastic job.
Can you briefly tell me what RICO stands for?
Yeah, racketeering, influenced, and corrupt organizations. And at that time, it was a pretty new, it was a fairly new statute, which the Congress had passed essentially to try to give the government a legal means of attacking organized crime, sometimes also known as the mafia. Now, I have to tell you that my Sicilian grandmother was not particularly pleased at the time that I would be involved somehow in the prosecution of Carlos Marcello. I tried to tell her I wasn't involved in the prosecution, I was working for the judge. But that was another thing that was interesting to me, was I did have that connection, at least to that ethnic group in my family at the time. 1999 or 2000, I can't remember exactly when, the chief judge of the Fifth Circuit tried to organize some relief for the horribly overburdened courts on the Mexico-United States border. And Judge Duplanche of our court, Adrian Duplanche, was sort of selected by her, the Chief Judge of the Fifth Circuit, to kind of coordinate that effort. So I volunteered to go over to Texas to sit, basically to relieve, well, at the time that there was a magistrate judge who was stationed in Alpine, Texas, whose husband became sick, and so she took a leave of absence, leaving nobody in the Alpine Court. She was the only judicial officer in the Alpine Court in Texas. And then in Laredo, Texas, in the Southern District of Texas, they only had one magistrate judge. And I remember the reason they needed help over there was his daughter was getting married, and she was getting married in Paris. And he kind of wanted to go to the wedding. But they had so much work to do that if he just went and left the work to pile up, by the time he came back, there would be no way to catch up. So I volunteered to go help, and I spent 1 week in Laredo, and then I spent another week in Laredo at a different time. And then I did 2 one-week terms riding the circuit, I guess, in the Western District of Texas, whereby, and they had one magistrate judge in the Western District of Texas to cover Midland, Alpine, and Pecos, which are all in Texas, but they ain't that close, okay? Especially to a New Orleans kid where you can basically walk everywhere. There were these 3 courthouses in Texas, which it might sound like they're really close together because they're all in the Western District. Well, they're not. They had one magistrate judge to cover those 3 courts. He also happened to be in the, I want to say the Army, the reserves of the National Guard or something, and he got called up. So I spent 2 tours out there. What I found interesting was, first of all, the volume of work. It was just overwhelming. They at that time, and I suppose still are, so overwhelmed with the numbers of illegal immigration, drug trafficking, and people trafficking cases that come over the Texas-Mexico border, that the volume of work that not just the magistrate judges had to do, but the district judges as well, to me was just unbelievable. I went over there for these, 1-week stints, and here when I do criminal duty here, if I would go out for a criminal docket consisting of preliminary matters like initial appearances and appointment of counsel, arraignment, setting of bond, preliminary matters, I might have 10 or 12 cases on the docket. Usually you can handle them in 45 minutes to an hour. In Laredo, I would walk out. First of all, we wouldn't do it once a day, we would do it twice a day, 10 and 2. You would walk out into the court, there'd be 150 defendants sitting out there. Most of them were Mexican nationals that had been arrested the night before. And it was just astonishing. And this would happen twice a day, every day, over and over again. I just couldn't believe it. Now, we here in New Orleans, we have had cases involving alleged illegal immigration, occasionally. We have a few more now than we used to have because of the influx of workers, I think, after the hurricane. But on the border courts, the volume of cases, it just can't adequately be described. Those judges out there, when I was going out there, and I think it's the same way now, although I haven't been out there since 2000, so, and I think the reason is they have made some additional judicial appointments. In Laredo, for example, the last time I went, they had just authorized a second magistrate judge position, and I got to meet the woman who had been selected but not yet sworn in. So now in Laredo, they have 2 magistrate judges instead of 1. But the volume was so incredible. The second thing was the cultural differences. When I walked into a courtroom in Laredo with 150 defendants, a couple of prosecutors, a couple of defenders, defense attorneys, and a staff of a courtroom deputy and 2 interpreters, 1 wasn't enough. I was the only one in the courtroom who couldn't speak Spanish. So there you are, you're faced with this tremendous volume, which gives you a great deal of respect for the job that the people who work out there every day are doing. And it's also a little overwhelming in terms of what's going on down there. The second thing is that Texas is a lot different than New Orleans. And I've traveled a lot. I traveled a lot as a lawyer, all over the place. But I hadn't been to that part of West Texas before. And when I drove from Midland to Alpine and then to Pecos through this vast expanse of nothingness, I mean, I was in complete geographical culture shock. I really liked Laredo a lot as a little city. And West Texas, when I went out to Alpine and Pecos, the vistas, the panorama was just overwhelming to a New Orleans boy like me. And so those are the two things that really struck me. The burden, the terrible burden that the situation on the border is placing on everybody involved, and the vast differences between that part of the country and where I'm from.
You always wanted to be a judge. How has that panned out for you? And
it's panned out fine. Here I am, I'm a judge. It made being a lawyer difficult, because a lawyer has several functions and jobs. The chief one of those is to advocate for his client. And I like to think that I advocated for my clients. But in the deepest parts of my insides, what I really wanted to do was just tell them why they were wrong or why they were right and go on to the next thing. And that's what I get to do now. And I think that psychologically, temperamentally, intellectually, whatever you want to call it, I'm better suited to be an arbiter than to be an advocate. That's just me. Not everybody's like that. I've got some friends who are lawyers who tell me every day they'd just jump out of a window if they had my job. They'd rather advocate. They'd rather know what they're supposed to be pushing for and then just push for it. Whereas I'd rather figure out, to my own satisfaction, what is right, okay? What is the correct result? Without caring about, whose ox may be gored, or who's right or wrong, or who thinks they're right or wrong, or who's going to win and who's going to lose, and who's going to have to pay and who's going to have to get. That doesn't concern me. I mean, I'm not, when I have some problem, and I learned this from Judge Sear, you make your decisions without regard to persons, which means that it doesn't matter if the government's on one side and an individual's on the other, or if there's a rich guy on one side and a poor guy on the other, or if there's somebody from Terrytown and somebody from Michigan on the other. It does not matter. The only thing that matters is figure out what the facts are and then apply the law. Okay? And if the guy from Terrytown, who you might feel more comfortable with watching a baseball game, loses, so be it. That's what I like. That's what I like. And as a lawyer, you've got to advocate for that person. Even if in your heart of hearts you know that that person has the weaker position and maybe shouldn't win. I enjoy being a magistrate judge. Like every job, it has some moments of tedium where you find yourself doing the same thing you just did a few days ago. But by and large, it's a great job, and I'm just to me, it's just a matter of just pure privilege and luck to have this job. So I'm not sure I'll be a magistrate judge forever, but I've really enjoyed it.
You have further aspirations?
I think that, of course, if I could rise in the judicial system and be a district judge, that would be terrific. But I don't have any expectations that that'll happen. But that would be terrific.